9 former directors of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are sounding the alarm on HHS Chief Robert F. Kennedy Jr. In a New York Times op-ed published on Labor Day, they blasted RFK Jr. over policy and personnel changes that he's made at the CDC, particularly the firing of its director, Susan Monterez. In the piece, they write in part, quote, "When Secretary Kennedy administered the oath of office to Dr. Monterez on July 31st, he called her a public health expert with unimpeachable scientific credentials, but when she refused weeks later to rubber stamp his dangerous and unfounded vaccine recommendations or heed his demand to fire senior CDC staff members, he decided she was expendable." The White House defended Monterez's firing, however, with Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt telling reporters last week that the president can fire people who are not aligned with his mission.
Meanwhile, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders penned his own op-ed Sunday demanding RFK Jr.'s resignation. In his New York Times essay, Sanders says Kennedy is endangering the lives of Americans and is doing the opposite of his slogan, "Make America Healthy Again." Sanders writing further, quote, "Despite the overwhelming opposition of the medical community, Secretary Kennedy has continued his long-standing crusade against vaccines and his advocacy of conspiracy theories that have been rejected repeatedly by scientific experts." Meanwhile, over the long weekend, Trump ordered drug makers to justify the success of their COVID-19 treatments. In a lengthy Truth Social post where he in part defended Kennedy, he also wrote, quote, "Many people think they are a miracle that saved millions of lives. Others disagree. With CDC being ripped apart over this question, I want the answer and I want it now." What do you make of all this?
Well, lots to discuss here. Let's circle back to the Trump part of it in a minute. So I was very frustrated with the CDC over the duration of the pandemic. I think they got a lot of guidance wrong. I think the vaccine part of it is, from my perspective, is the part where I'm least at odds with them. I'm really at odds with them over their recommendations regarding masking, social distancing, which we now know were kind of cobbled together on the spot. How long schools remain closed was actually a direct function of the CDC putting pressure, I would argue, at the behest of the teachers' unions to keep the schools closed. And then, of course, they screwed up the testing right off the bat. They centralized the COVID testing and they got the tests wrong, which was a huge failure and a black spot on the agency. You know, the fact that former heads of the agency are frustrated with the direction, they could be right, they could be wrong. I don't think pursuing RFK Jr.'s, someone I agree with on some things and not on others, his hobby horse of the autism connection, which is not something that I've seen persuasive evidence of at all, just because, you know, a lot of anti-liberal people wanted to reject everything experts and mainstream people think. I think some things mainstream and expert people think are wrong and others are right. The autism stuff, I've never actually seen evidence of that submitted to me. So I'm wary of what's going on here. If it's really about just pushing this hobby horse of RFK Jr.'s, that's not something I would be happy about. If it's about, you know, atoning for some of the other failures and they're trying to make it about vaccines because that's the sort of least defensible part of the agenda, then that would be something else.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, I don't think that the CDC or any body should be above criticism. And of the things that you listed there, I think the school closures is the one that in retrospect has proven most difficult to defend or difficult to justify. Certainly the duration of those closures, and we know now that it, I think, has been pretty conclusively demonstrated that there were various concomitant effects of that lengthy school closure in terms of social learning, the acquisition of social skills, a kind of disintegration of the sense of community that can be very important, particularly to, well, I was going to say to younger children, but actually through adolescence and all the rest of it. So I do take that point. Where I think I differ with Kennedy, certainly, and some of the other people who are more avowedly anti-CDC, is that I think, broadly speaking, during the pandemic, they were grappling with a once-in-a-century horrendous situation, doing the best they could and making some mistakes in the course of that. And that's understandable. Nobody, I think, is going to handle something like that perfectly or close to perfectly. Where I have the bigger problem with Kennedy is the vaccine part, which you've already mentioned, the debunked suggestion that there's a link between vaccines and autism. The fact that just very recently they have made the vaccines harder to get for people who are adults with no other comorbidities. They still allow them to be got without doctor's advice for young children and older people, young babies, I think, and older people. Maybe that's wrong about babies. Certainly older people.
That was in the Bernie op-ed, right? He wrote, and actually, I kind of disagreed with this part, and maybe I disagree with you. Short term, it will be harder for Americans to get life-saving vaccines. Already, the Trump administration has effectively taken away COVID vaccines from many healthy younger adults and kids, unless, they get the doctor's prescription. But, and I don't want to make anything harder to get, really. When RFK Jr. was interviewed by my colleagues at Reason Magazine, they said, do you want to make drugs harder to get or easier to get? And he said, I don't want to make it harder or easier. I don't want to move directionally one way or the other. I don't want to make it harder for people to get things, and certainly not older Americans, immunocompromised Americans for whom the vaccine is conclusively demonstrated to do a lot of good. But we also don't just, Vinay Prasad has said this, and this has affected my thinking, we don't just give pharmaceutical interventions to people if there's no evidence that they will, even if they're not going to do harm, that there's not going to do them any good. Like, we don't just give antibiotics to people on demand. You got to demonstrate you're actually sick with that thing. Like, if you go into the doctor and say, I have a sore throat, they got to prove you have an infection before they're going to give you antibiotics. If it's just something viral, they're not going to give it to you. And now, if we were with someone who had that, they might weigh other factors, but they don't just give it to you willy-nilly. And I think that's the same thinking around the vaccines for COVID, for otherwise healthy adults and teenagers.
But
because it can't demonstrate a statistical difference in your health outcome. That's why I don't think making it a little harder under that circumstance to get it is a big deal.
But surely the rebuttal to that is, well, two things really. One is the parallel or the analog would be flu shots, which people are able to just wander into a CVS or Walgreens and get. That there had been the situation where COVID boosters were able to be got in that level. And to the point about statistics, I mean, it is true that actually the vaccines do lower your chances of being hospitalized if you get COVID, regardless of what age you are.
But your odds of being hospitalized if you are a teenager or otherwise healthy adult are so astronomically low anyway that you can't statistically demonstrate a difference, is my understanding. Which is why European countries have moved in that direction as well. For, again, not overall, but for teenagers. And the difference with the flu vaccine might be COVID is was at its peak so many more times contagious than the flu that the immunity we have from prior strains might be more vast than what we have from the flu, because not everybody gets the flu every year. And at some point, like 90% of all people on Earth had COVID. Let's very quickly go back to Trump by the end of this. I think his comments could be read in multiple ways because he wants to take credit for Operation Warp Speed. So I kind of saw him not exactly weighing in on Kennedy's side, or I don't think he wants to back away from that achievement. I think he was actually sincerely pointing to defenders of the vaccine to say, come up with a messaging campaign to prove why this worked that I want to take credit for, not saying I'm disassociating myself from this.
Yeah, as you say, we're almost out of time, but I saw him kind of akin to that, except a bit more cynical. I think he's trying to thread a needle where he can keep taking credit for Operation Warp Speed, but he kind of pays lip service to the anti-vax people who like Canada.
Well, I'm sure we'll discuss that more later this week. Next on Rising, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem claims Los Angeles would have burned down if it weren't for the National Guard. Don't go anywhere.